Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this is reading from Canto 1, Chapter 15, verse 31 through 33. And this is the lamentation of Arjuna, the final 3 verses. So the translation. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus, he was freed from the 3 modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. Text 32. Upon hearing of Lord Kṛṣṇa's returning to his abode, and upon understanding the end of the Yadu dynasty's earthly manifestation, Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira decided to go back home, back to Godhead. And text 33, Kuntī, after overhearing Arjuna's telling of the end of the Yadu dynasty and disappearance of Lord Kṛṣṇa, engaged in the devotional service of the transcendental personality of Godhead with full attention, and thus gained release from the course of material existence. So I will be focusing on text 31, and I'll read the translation and purport again. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus, he was freed from the 3 modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. Purport. Doubts of duality begin from the misconception of the material body, which is accepted as the self by less intelligent persons. The most foolish part of our ignorance is our identifying this material body with the self. Everything in relation with the body is ignorantly accepted as our own. Doubts due to misconceptions of myself and mine. In other words, my body, my relatives, my property, my wife, my children, my wealth, my country, my community, and hundreds and thousands of similar illusory contemplations cause bewilderment for the conditioned soul. By assimilating the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, one is sure to be released from such bewilderment, because real knowledge is knowledge that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, Lord Kṛṣṇa, is everything, including oneself. Everything is a manifestation of his potency as part and parcel. The potency and the potent are non-different, so the conception of duality is at once mitigated by attainment of perfect knowledge. As soon as Arjuna took up the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, expert as he was, he could at once eradicate the material conception of Lord Kṛṣṇa, his eternal friend. He could realize that the Lord was still present before him by his instruction, by his form, by his pastimes, by his qualities, and everything else related to him. He could realize that Lord Kṛṣṇa, his friend, was still present before him by his transcendental presence in different non-dual energies. And there was no question of attainment of the association of the Lord by another change of body under the influence of time and space. By attainment of absolute knowledge, one can be in association with the Lord constantly, even in this present life, simply by hearing, chanting, thinking of, and worshiping the Supreme Lord. One can see him, one can feel his presence, even in this present life, simply by understanding the Advaya Gyan Lord, or the Absolute Lord, through the process of devotional service, which begins with hearing about him. Lord Chaitanya says that simply by chanting the holy name of the Lord, one can at once wash off the dust on the mirror of pure consciousness And as soon as the dust is removed, one is at once freed from all material conditions. To become free from material conditions means to liberate the soul. As soon as one is, therefore, situated in absolute knowledge, his material conception of life is removed, or he emerges from a false conception of life. Thus, the function of the pure soul is revived in spiritual realization. This practical realization of the living being is made possible due to his becoming free from the reaction of the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance. By the grace of the Lord, a pure devotee is at once raised to the place of the absolute. And there is no chance of the devotees becoming materially entangled again in conditioned life. One is not able to feel the presence of the Lord in all circumstances until one is endowed with the required transcendental vision made possible by devotional service prescribed in the revealed scriptures. Arjuna had attained this stage long before on the battle of Kurukshetra. And when he apparently felt the absence of the Lord, he at once took shelter of the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita. And thus again, he was placed in his original position. This is the position of Vishoka, or the stage of being freed from all grief and anxiety. Now I will say the invocation, pray for blessings to speak something of value. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshitarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'm grateful to be here with you this morning and to be so immersed in the reflections and the teachings of the Bhagavatam and the Gita and Srila Prabhupada's words. They're so beautiful and so profound. And so this is our final day for Lamentation of Arjuna. And we've been immersed in these reflections the past couple months. And I kind of wanted to reflect back on this whole journey for Arjuna. And, it begins in the 14th chapter with Yudhiṣṭhira approaching his brother Arjuna saying, you look ill, you've lost your bodily luster, you don't look so well, what's going on with you? And, are you sick? Or maybe you've offended someone, or you haven't done your duty? Somehow, maybe something's wrong, but then wait, maybe you're missing your friend, Krishna, because Krishna has left this planet. He's not here anymore. So that must be what it is. And Arjuna confirms that Krishna's gone and he's missing him. And what's so beautiful is that in these past verses, he's reflected on his personal friendship and relationship with Krishna and how much he misses him. But he returns to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. And because it's said here that Arjuna has spiritual assets. So he has an asset here. They're very valuable. He heard the Bhagavad Gita personally from Lord Kṛṣṇa. What an asset to have, right? So he is falling back on that spiritual asset, which is that he's had Krishna as his eternal friend, and also that he's heard these instructions from Krishna himself. So he's returned to the teachings of the Gita. And so I kind of wanted to reflect a bit on these teachings, and Prabhupada touches upon them in the purport. We begin with this false identification with the body and this sense of my body, my relatives. And Prabhupada gives this really amazing list of my family, my children, my wealth. This is my body. And then he says there's hundreds and thousands of similar illusory contemplations. So not just like a few, hundreds and thousands. One person can have hundreds and thousands of illusory contemplations. It's not even just a label, it's a contemplation. It's an interesting word there, because it becomes a source of reflection and deep immersion in that identity. But that causes bewilderment. And this is a source of all grief and all suffering, actually, is this misidentification. So it's a misidentification because it's false identification. It's not actually who I am. Like, and I don't own anything, like my children, my wealth. I was thinking of this phrase, I'm not this body and have a soul. I am a soul and I have a body. That is my true identification as a soul. And along with the body comes all the other identifications. The culmination of the keystone teaching of the Gita is that you are not this body. So actually in chapter 2, verse 11 of the Gita, after Arjuna has surrendered to Krishna and said, please instruct me, then Krishna responds with his very first instruction. And he says, I'm going to read it out here because it's a keystone teaching, and we'll talk about what a keystone teaching is. So he says, this is verse 11 in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. While speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. So this is the very first teaching of the Gita. And I went camping the past few days in St. Augustine. And when I was walking along, I saw a sign that said, don't disturb the gopher tortoises, because these are keystone species. And what is a keystone species? And it showed this really interesting diagram of a gopher tortoise kind of burrowing into the ground. And it creates this tunnel, kind of like a gopher. So it creates this tunnel. And in this diagram at the state park, there were all these little other tunnels that went out, and they showed all these other little animals that use that tunnel. And basically, this gopher tortoise provides shelter in some way through his burrowing for up to at least 360 other species. So like an owl uses it for its nest, ants, other little rodents, other birds, they use this gopher tortoise's tunnel for their own life. If you remove the gopher tortoise from this environment, it will severely impact hundreds of species of life in the area. So that's what a keystone species is, that it's so dependent, so many others are depending on this one species. And so it was sweet because there were all these other little road signs, tortoise crossing, they had the little turtle on the sign, and I saw one crossing the road the next day. It was very cute, a gopher tortoise. In a sense, this is a teaching of the Bhagavad Gita that is the keystone of everything else. This sense that every other conception must be built on this. If we don't have this understanding that I am not this body, right? That the source of all of our grief and our mourning is for something not worthy of grief, right? And then the next teaching is that never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be, because the soul is eternal. So he mentions this, you're mourning what is not worthy of grief. So it's a little bit of deja vu going on here, because again, Arjuna is lamenting. But this time he's not lamenting, the potential death of all of his relatives and being the one who kills them on the battlefield, but he's actually lamenting Krishna himself. And so this time Krishna's not there to instruct him, but because Arjuna has his spiritual assets, he's returning to the instructions of his friend. So this Keystone teaching is so essential. And, Prabhupada talks about on this particular verse, he says that this is so important. This is so basic knowledge. Like even a child can understand that life comes from life. And if you take 2 + 2 = 4, but if you have 2 + 2 = 5, that's a misconception. And actually, in material calculations, if you make a misstep, no matter what calculations you make after that, it will always come up wrong. So you have to have this right spiritual conception, this truth, this tattva from the very beginning. Otherwise, everything else won't add up properly. So that falsely identifying with the body, that's where we make that 2 + 2 = 5. And no matter what other mathematical calculations we make after that, it's all going to be useless because I'm misidentifying. Our problem here is that we're falsely identifying with the body. We have my, mine, and then we understand that we're not this body. In the Gita, the teachings are there, and Arjuna is remembering them. And then we have to know that absolute knowledge frees us from this misconception. So the truth is actually what will set us free. Prabhupada says something, he says very beautifully here, one can see him, one can feel his presence, even in this present life, simply by understanding the Advaya Gyan Lord, or the absolute Lord, through the process of devotional service. And especially by beginning by hearing about him. He's talking about his friend, Krishna. And it's interesting because it's just Arjuna speaking throughout this lamentation. And Yudhiṣṭhira is just listening. But by this speaking about Krishna, it's also like he's remembering him, hearing about him. He feels the soothing in his heart and he comes back to the teachings that Krishna has given him. Apparently, like at the end of the purport, Prabhupada says that Arjuna had attained this stage long before the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So he had actually attained the stage of connection with Krishna, loving him, being fully realized. But by taking that shelter of the Gita, then again, he was placed in his original position. He ends by saying, this is the position of Vishoka, or the stage of being freed from all grief and anxieties. And Prabhupada emphasizes that word Vishoka in the lecture he gives on this verse in 1972, Los Angeles, because this being freed from all grief and anxieties is this yearning of the soul. This grief is what we all experience. And that grief at the core is missing Krishna. It's interesting because in the Bhagavad Gita verse, that very first Keystone teaching, the word uses asochan, which means not worthy of grief. And in this verse, what's emphasized is vishoka, or freed from lamentation and grief. So this grief is so key. It seems like such a key point for our existence, that we're all grieving in some way. We're all missing Krishna in some way, and it's expressed in different ways. Everyone is expressing it, and we all want to be freed from it, and we're all looking for Krishna, but it's being expressed in ways that we're not finding Krishna. So how do we find him? We have to have the truth. I was really appreciating when Shamala shared a few weeks ago about soothing the burning heart, taking shelter of the teachings of the Gita. And for me personally, these teachings about the nature of the soul have given me so much solace over the years. I kind of wanted to conclude and direct us for discussion on this point about how the source of suffering is material identification, Prabhupada says there's literally hundreds and thousands of illusory contemplations. We can identify with our bodies, gender, politics, race, sexual orientation, anything. There are hundreds and thousands of misidentifications. Like I was even thinking, like, okay, I am a woman. I am like Spanish from Spain. I am Guamanian, but I was also thinking, like just a few years ago, I realized that like, if you look at my ears, you'll see that my right here has this like little tab on it. Do you see? Like there's no little tab on the left ear. There's like this little tab here. And it's like, oh, my ears are mismatched. Like I am a woman with mismatched ears. Like, and I can get so identified with that, and I can like resist that and be like, oh, do I need to like get plastic surgery to make sure my ears match? Like it's endless. Literally, I can take anything and identify. Like I am this, I am that. I am a woman with brown eyes. Like, and if I identify with that, if someone kind of like says either it's going to go away or there's something so-called wrong with it, then I have to change it somehow. And there's like this kind of resisting the reality of my body and my life and what I was born here on this planet right now. What's interesting is that what makes these illusory identifications that they're temporary. It's not that they're not real. They're illusory because they're temporary. This material world is temporary. That's what makes it an illusion. Krishna urges Arjuna to fight as a Kshatriya in the second chapter, later on, like in verse 32. He's actually berating him for not doing his duty as a Kshatriya. You could say that, but isn't that a material designation, a material identification? But Arjuna wanted to spiritually bypass that duty by giving it up, right? But he needs to actually understand what is his reality in this lifetime, in this body. What is his duty right now? And by accepting that duty, there's an actually giving up of the results of the action, which is what Krishna eventually teaches. My reflection is that there are certain identifications that need to be reckoned with and accepted and understood in order to move through them and then give them up. So staying stuck on that identity, like, oh, I am a Kshatriya, or I am a woman, I am an American, staying stuck on that and building a whole life around that identity can cause so much suffering and grief. But understanding, okay, I have this body, I'm a soul and I have a body, just like a tool, I have something. So I need to first understand what is my context in this life. First, understanding who I am, and then I can move through it. To spiritually bypass is not going to work, and it's not sustainable. I was thinking as a first question, kind of like, what are one or two of your identities that you are struggling to come to terms with that are keeping you from moving forward spiritually and in life? So again, there are hundreds and thousands. It literally could be anything that you're identifying with strongly, or there's something that's blocking you from moving forward. So thinking like, what's keeping you from that spiritual progress? So that was my first question. And then my second question for discussion and reflection is that Prabhupada mentions that one can experience Krishna in this very life through a scientific process of devotion. So, and Arjuna is soothed and placed in his original position by remembering Krishna and his teachings. And I think it's fascinating that Prabhupada's saying you can experience it in this life. It's not something that you have to die and go to another place to experience. Spiritual experiences are not bound by those kinds of rules, by material rules. So they can be experienced in this life. And it's beautiful. Just by chanting the holy name, it can be experienced if our heart is truly open. So we've all had some experience. I would wager that all of us have had some kind of experience. Thank you for hearing what I shared today. And Hare Krishna.